appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you. So what I've been asked to do is to kind of bring together what we heard from the distinguished speakers and panelists, and then add a few thoughts of my own looking forward. And I think that Sergio and then Naveen and Rafat did a very good job of laying the foundation of how important this is, as well as the importance that policy and regulation will have on both the digital asset space and AI, particularly generative AI. Adrian Harris, of course, did a very good job of explaining in a very dynamic way, I thought, how New York Department of Financial Services is tackling these areas, particularly digital assets. They haven't been as involved yet with generative AI. What I was struck by with the panel, and this showed up a little bit in the preceding speakers as well, is that we're talking in many ways about very basic high-level questions that academics and historians have been looking at for years about regulation. This isn't the first time we've had to figure out how to regulate something that previously hadn't been regulated or even was new in general, not just new to regulation. There are just inherently important questions that are very difficult. The question of timing. As we look back in history, there are points where we've delayed too long in trying to regulate things. There are other times we've come in too soon, and it's been an impediment to innovation. There isn't one right answer here, which is why you found everyone struggling with how to define what that point is. And you just have to do your best. And a really fundamental point about most regulation is that it's a balancing act. Occasionally there's some type of regulation where everybody's better off by having it. But in general, regulation, particularly in financial services, is about weighing the costs and the benefits, which is also one reason that the timing is something of an issue. So you heard various discussions of what are those costs and benefits. There's question of how do you have the appropriate level of flexibility. Now that flexibility is probably particularly important in very fast new areas, fast-growing, fast-changing new areas like digital assets and generative AI. But you always want to find the right balance of flexibility. For instance, some jurisdictions tend to go with principles-based approaches, with the theory that you want to put the regulation at a reasonably high level and then rely on the industry to obey that spirit and to do it in a sensible manner. Whereas other jurisdictions, and the U.S. I think particularly tends to be in this way, take a more detailed, almost, and indeed sometimes actually legalistic approach. And there are pros and cons here. I will say on that one, it's probably pretty clear that at this stage of development, you need a relatively principles-based approach compared to where we might get to later on with these technologies. And of course, there's public-private interaction. There are a lot of benefits to making sure public sector and private sector are talking. I don't think I probably need to spend a lot of time explaining those. But there are also disadvantages. You can have regulatory capture. You could have excessive influence of the private sector. It's not, and also it just takes a lot of time as well. But this is another area where, because of its newness, both digital assets and generative AI, where I think there's a particular premium on making sure you have that interaction between the public and private sector. And I think pretty much every one of the speakers earlier emphasized that. And then there's questions of regulatory arbitrage. how do you deal with a situation where either different jurisdictions have different levels of regulation, or even, as often happens in the U.S., different regulators within the U.S. may have different degrees of stringency in how they regulate, or even it's not about stringency, but it's just different approaches. So all of these questions are common to regulation, period. And thankfully, there's been a lot of good study over the years. Regretfully, none of them give you sort of the cookbook answer. So what I wanted to segue to is some of my own thoughts on this. And I'd say there are three broad themes I wanted to emphasize. One, we need more realism, particularly on digital assets, where I've spent more of my time than I have on generative AI. You have public and private sector with quite different views, and often a degree of unreality in the views of each side. It's possible those of you who haven't been following the regulatory debate as closely, after listening this morning, might actually come away feeling pretty comfortable that there's a rapport between industry and the regulators and policymakers. But a lot of that has to do with the forum we're in and the particular people who are attracted to this forum, who tend to be, like Adrian Harris, very forward-looking in this area. But a core of my own job is to speak with senior policymakers in the financial community globally. And something that became clear to me, and I actually wrote a paper called Crypto Assets, Tulips or .coms to lay it out, is, again, this is narrowly focused on crypto assets, but applies more broadly in a little more general terms. There are four groups of policymakers out there. There's a group that really does think crypto assets are just that tulip bubble all over again, or any of the other bubbles we've had since then. And there's a group of them who believes you shouldn't even have regulation in this space because it will just encourage people to actually be involved in digital assets, and that's just a bad thing. Next over on the spectrum, there's a group I call skeptics who don't think this is going to go away on its own, therefore do think there needs to be regulation, but they'd like extremely strict regulation, and they'd like to keep crypto assets away from anything they care about, like the banking system. There's a next group over on the spectrum, what I tend to call the pragmatists, and these people aren't that keen, frankly, on crypto assets either, but they believe that it's here to stay and will be increasingly enmeshed with the rest of the financial system. And so they believe the important things are to get the right laws, regulations, and supervisory approaches to handle that. And then there's the final group, and it's maybe only a tenth, at most a fifth of the policymakers I speak with, who I would call more supporters. And even they view this a little bit as Segal had mentioned herself, view this a little bit like the dot-com boom at the end of the 1990s, very beginning of the 2000s, in the sense that you can see all sorts of bad things in crypto space and from that earlier period in terms of naivete, investments out of ignorance, outright fraud, lots of bad things. And yet, if this is at all like the dot-com boom, what we'll discover is there's been a big economic benefit as we move out of this, as some people call it, sort of Wild West period, and turn this into a solider base of tools with real use cases. Obviously, some of that already exists, but as that becomes dominant and becomes substantially larger. So that's the policy community. They really do have a range of views and generally not that favorable. of course, you still have in the private sector a significant chunk of people who simply don't believe in regulation. Many of them aren't that keen on government, period. And of course, Bitcoin originally was set up to be able to sidestep governments, regulations, et cetera, by sort of bringing power to the individual. So I was mentioning realism. On the policymaker side, I think they need to be either in the pragmatic camp or in the supporter camp, depending where they come out. But in a recognition this is real, it will be getting bigger, it will indeed be more enmeshed with the financial system, they need to just come to grips with that. Similarly, on the private sector, there is going to have to be a lot of regulation. It will happen, and it's important to realistically take that into account and be part of the debates about how to do that, rather than, as is still true of some, trying to hold it back as much as possible. So you've got, I think, a need for more realism. I think you also need to accept the degree of uncertainty we have. I co-authored another paper on 4 visions for the future of money. The key point there simply was to say, we don't know what's going to happen with digital assets. And that paper was a little more narrowly focused on digital money. But we don't know whether we're going to end up with a future which is more dominated by traditional finance and maybe deposit tokens become the main form of digital money, or whether it'll be more dominated by crypto-native firms and its stable coins will be more the norm, whether the central banks might actually overshoot their intent and establish a CBDC that comes to dominate digital money, or whether you'd have a fourth scenario we put in as sort of an extreme scenario, is it's kind of the revolution and we have DeFi really taking over, in which case it's a little less clear what the form of digital money would be. But too many people focus on trying to predict the future when both with generative AI and with digital assets, we're in too early a phase. It's much better to be prepared through sort of scenario analysis and think of a range of possibilities. And then the final point I wanted to make is just on communication. Taking account of that realism and of the uncertainty, it is very important that there be a lot of discussion constructively between public and private sector on these issues, and that the public discourse also be clearly communicated in that realistic way and taking account of the uncertainties. And I am a big believer, I have been my whole career, in the importance of the private and public sector communicating and working together towards the common good, which I do believe we can do in these spaces as well. So, again, I'd like to thank all those who came before me here. I thought they had a great deal of wisdom and interesting viewpoints. And looking forward to the rest of the Point Zero Forum. And I know the themes that have come up are going to continue to resonate, including in the next panel. So I will step off now and yield my, I think, 55 seconds I still have left. So please give me a little credit for brevity. Thank you.